Hi, I'm Danielle Belton, editor-in-chief of The Root, and this is Art and Activism, a response to what we are facing in America. This conversation is hosted by The Root, the leading African-American news source, and the Brotherhood and Sister Soul. This conversation originally was just to be about COVID-19, but as you all know, in recent weeks, many Americans have taken to the streets demanding justice over the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and many, many others. We want to talk today about the impact both these crises are having on our community in a discussion sponsored by both The Root and Brotherhood Sister Soul, topics we're both extremely passionate about. With me today in discussion are Khary Lazarre-White, the Executive Director of Brotherhood Sister Soul, a youth development and social justice organization based in Harlem. Khary is also a novelist and author of Passage, which was named to the Wall Street Journal's Best New Fiction list. Also, we have Elizabeth Acevedo. She is a New York Times bestselling author of The Poet X, which received the 2018 National Book Award for Young People's Literature, and With the Fire on High. Kirkus Reviews calls her latest book, Clap When You Land, a standing ovation. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle.
I really appreciate you guys having this conversation with me today. I think it's so important for our communities. And so the first question that I have for both of you is for you to individually tell us about your work, your intersectional work as artists and activists.
Go ahead, Liz.
I came to poetry predominantly through hip hop. I wanted to be a rapper. And partly I think it was because although I was a voracious reader growing up, I didn't see a lot of literature that seemed to reflect the background that I was coming from in a way that felt tender and generous. And although I would never disparage Walter D. Myers and Jacqueline Woodson and Sandra Cisneros who were doing that work, it just felt like there weren't enough volumes on the shelves. And so I came to hip hop. I was going to be picked up by Rockefeller. I had these big dreams. And through the evolution of meeting other rappers and meeting mentors, and through the Brotherhood Sister Soul, which was a foundational organization when I was growing up, I began kind of expanding the ways I thought I could tell a story. And so I have competed in poetry slams. I have published a collection of poetry. I have several different novels. I write terrible tweets. But for me, part of my artistic endeavor is what are the different formats I can use to talk about the community I come from in a way that feels like it is sourced honestly, and also that it is unflinching in how it looks at us, right? And I say us because I'm very particular and hyper specific in who I assume my audience to be. And so I'll say that any of the work I do is kind of with that ethos.
Amazing. Khary?
Well, I would say first about Liz. Liz has been a leader since I first met her. We at the Brotherhood Sister Soul, we're a social justice organization doing youth development work before she joined our ranks, but she walked in the door and within her first couple of weeks asked where the space was for poets, for MCs. And she and another young person created a program that was really due to their lead, a space for artists, a space for writers that still stands today. And so as a 14-year-old, she was already the powerful spirit that she is today. So I just want to kind of underline that we go way back, and from the beginning, she's been artist and activist. For me, that's how I identify as an artist activist. I believe in art that challenges. I believe in art that really pushes the edges, pushes the conversation. There's been a long kind of discussion in the space of Black art about the role of the artist. It's been a conversation that goes, back to the Harlem Renaissance, back to the time of Reconstruction. What is the role of the Black artist? And, I've always come down squarely on the side that you have a responsibility. It doesn't mean that all art needs to be political. It doesn't mean that all art has to be overt in that way, but by creating art as Black people in this country, it is inherently political. It is inherently, you are using your voice, and that is a voice that historically was submerged, was oppressed, was suppressed. And now I think there's a responsibility to speak out to, what we're seeing in this world now and today. And that doesn't mean that you don't have the space to create in lots of different ways, but I do think you have an added responsibility And, that is something that, I embrace and has been a central part of my identity for a very long time.
Khary, art has like just tremendous power. I mean, a lot of people tend to discount, the influence that television, film, art, music, the influence it can have on individuals and people. Can you kind of elaborate on the power of art to move people, to get people to organize?
I think in general, art has always been central to movements for freedom and equality all around the world. I mean, I think, Liz and I are both writers. I think there's something very specific about telling a story through a personal narrative that people can identify with a character. And through that identification, Chinua Achebe called it imaginative identification. You can imagine another's experience through that personal narrative. It opens worlds. It allows me to imagine the experience of, a young Chinese American girl growing up because I read Maxine Han Kingston's work. It allows me to imagine the experience of somebody who's undocumented because I read a narrative from that perspective. So I think that has a very specific reality, that it allows one to walk in the shoes of another. I mean, I think that's what great writing can do. Very specifically, again, in the American and the Black American context, every aspect of social change in our history has been deeply interconnected with art. You don't have the abolitionist movement without the very specific African-American autobiography, whether it's Harriet Jacobs or whether it's Frederick Douglass, so that somebody can, again, imagine what that experience is like. The role of the Black artist, whether it's music, whether it's film, whether it's the written word, has been central. And I don't think you can understand jazz or blues. I don't think you can certainly understand hip hop without understanding rebellion. I mean, that's been part and parcel to movements. We always have the best songs. We always create the best art, and there's something about looking at people who, were in these movements and in this time, and the relationships between artists and activists, and the way that at time those lines were blurred. And I think that, they go hand in hand. And whether, you're looking at something like the Black Power movement, I think the style of the Black Power movement, the art, the imagery, the way folks wore their hair, the clothes that they wore, that was all central to it. And I don't think that you can separate that. And, when I read the words of Baldwin, it's the artist and the activist, and it runs hand in hand. It's just the day-to-day experience. And so I think that's been our history in this country. I think it's been the reality of the Black artist. And I think it continues to be absolutely central. It's what moves people. Yes. And I think that, one of the powerful aspects of Liz's work is that she's telling stories of young people, Afro-Latinas, young people who are bisexual, and young people who are coming of age in this world that have not been told before. And so there is a overtly political statement in that I will tell stories of those whose stories have maybe been silenced for so long. And, I just commend her for that work.
Liz, so when you consider your work as a poet, as an author, as an artist, when you consider that intersection between art and activism, what does that look like to you? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think that it's my roots. Even when I entered the doors of Brotherhood, Sister Soul, I was writing very much about what I was seeing, right? And I grew up in an interesting neighborhood that is kind of bookended by Columbia University on one end, and then like the most, rat infested, really disenfranchised community on another one, right? If you are on Morningside Park. And so in this way, I kind of knew Broadway is not the same as Columbus. And as a 12-year-old, when I began really studying hip hop, right? I would go online and study rap lyrics and underline things. For me, the reason I wanted to write was because I wanted to speak about that discrepancy, right? That was the impetus for my even going to the pen. Was I see something that does not make sense. Maybe if I kind of struggle through language, I can corral this into something I can hold, right? And I didn't necessarily have this metacognitive understanding, but I knew something is happening. I'm not reading about it in my books. I'm not sure who I can talk to about this. How do I write it through it? And so my work has always kind of been, what do I see and what are the questions that I have? And I think it's important for me to root a lot of my writing in wonder, right? And in imagining worlds that might be different depending on how the ending goes. I write for young people, and so I write about hope. I write about how do we come together. I write about solidarity, but in ways that a young person can look at and really grasp it and put themselves right in those spaces. So when I write about a teen parent who makes it through the world, who becomes a chef, who is able to follow a dream, that is really my saying, all of the teen mothers that I knew growing up, all of the parents that I knew that were doing that work, young parents, how do we talk about them in ways where they are the hero, as opposed to the ways that we often vilify them? When I write about a young woman who is often catcalled, who tries to reclaim her body, I'm not thinking about it as, oh, this is gonna be a big political statement, but I am thinking about it as a, how do we reclaim our understanding of girlhood and Afro-Latinidad and our communities, so that the young person reading this can imagine themselves in the role of thriving, of being loved, of being worthy, right? I think that when we don't see ourselves in art, when we don't see ourselves in the world, we don't see ourselves in media, we often begin to wonder, like, how do I exist if I don't have any blueprint or example to go off of? And so I think I'm always looking at, where's the gap where a child might fall and won't see themselves? And can I write into that? And then I like try to drop little gems. So in my latest novel, the one character who's really into activism loves Nina Simone, right? And Nina Simone is who she plays when she's drawing protest signs. And Nina Simone is who she plays when she's thinking about the latest thing that happened. And so I'm also trying to create almost a chronology of artists, right? I try to drop people that other folks can read and realize I'm in a lineage and we are in a lineage. And so if you like this work, I might be able to open the door to someone who's going to activate you to do even more and be a little bit more political. And so I think it's this web. I don't use the word activism often. I think I'm a little quieter in claiming that term, but I try to be incredibly thoughtful about what I put in my books, so that it is a clear reflection of how much I love us, but also what I think we are capable of. And I hope that young people and anybody reading kind of feels galvanized by that.
So my next question, I kind of want to put things, into context around this conversation that we're having. As we all know, people have taken to the streets over the death of George Floyd and countless others at the hands of the police. And George Floyd is dead because of racism, full stop. And then there's the reality that while those people take to the streets, they're putting their lives at risk for COVID-19, a disease that has been disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities, specifically Black African Americans. And that often is also due to structural racism that exists within our medical systems. And so I'm wondering from both of you, we can start with you, Khary, how does history and legacy inform these issues that we're confronting today?
I think that it's a great kind of pivot, Liz's example of her work and using Nina Simone. I don't think we can really understand the realities we're facing today, the conditions that have people out in the streets protesting, without talking about history. I believe that history informs where we are today. And the point of talking about history is not to be caught up in another time. It's that it illuminates where we are and where we need to go. And so the police murders that bring people out into the streets, we can't fully understand the type of systemic racism and racist policing that occurs without knowing that modern police forces are based on slave patrols. So the creation of systems to control Black human bodies, right? That's the history of police forces. That's why they were created. The NYPD was greatly expanded post the Civil War because of, quote, riots by white working class people in the city who were refusing to go south to fight on the side of the Union Army. And so the police were greatly expanded because of that. When we deal with an issue like systemic racism, I often cite the statistics of generations. And I think that's key because it shows the length of what we're dealing with. There were 13 generations of Black people born into slavery in this country. There were 4 generations born into segregation, and there have been 2 generations born legally free. So we can have a conversation about what legal freedom means, but how can we discuss what systemic racism is without dealing with the fact that 17 generations experience either slavery or apartheid American style, the complete subjugation of a people for no other reason that they were Black and brown, A. And B, I think this is really important in terms of the diversity of America now. My father grew up in the South. I believe he didn't see an Asian person until he came to Atlantic City to work one summer. The only Latinx identified people were Cubans who were part of the Black community there as well. The world was seen as white and Black. And now you have a lot of folks who are coming into the conversation who have to understand that their immigrant experience is completely unique and completely theirs and completely specific, and we have to honor that. However, they are stepping into a nation that has been divided along the one drop rule and Black and white since its founding. And so you can't expect that you are not now inherently a part of that reality as well. It's a very unique American phenomenon around the issue of race and color and how it was dealt with in this country. So again, if you don't understand that history, then some of these issues will not really fully make sense to you either. So I think history illuminates where we are currently. I think that as we look at the ability of state control of Black people, slavery was state control of Black people. Segregation was state control of Black people. The explosion of the prison industrial complex is state control of Black people. And so when people are in the streets protesting, what they are protesting is that legacy. They may be protesting the single killing of George Floyd and the horrific realities of what we saw in that video. But the totality of what we are protesting is the totality of American history and where we stand today.
Liz, where do you think that history and legacy, how do you believe they inform this moment that we're in?
I don't know if you see me out here taking notes. I'm like, Khary's dropping gems. I'm completely with all of that Khary said, and I don't want to double down on anything that's already been stated. But one thing that I've been thinking a lot about in this moment is that both my parents are from the Dominican Republic. I have a massive family that's all located either in Manhattan or in the Bronx. And so there have been a lot of conversations that I am having that is around trying to contextualize what this moment is for folks who are coming with a very different history, right? And so, and a very particular sense of respectability that makes them want to be the model minority, right? We don't want to get in trouble. We don't want any issues with authority. We just want to make sure that we like put our heads down, work hard, and be able to buy a house in DR, right? And so when that is where they're coming in from, part of the conversation that I'm having to have is like when someone says, when they start looting, we start shooting, like that has a particular context that hails back, right, to 1968, right? Yes. And that moment in time. And so we're seeing an echo here of what's happening. And if you don't see that, if we're saying that we're going to do the same thing, however many decades later, that is a problem. But if you don't know that history, you can't even respond to the rhetoric, right? When we talk about the fact that it was the 99th anniversary of the destruction of Black Wall Street this past weekend, right? So we're talking about almost 100 years, right? Where this community said we are going to be self-sufficient. We're going to make sure that the dollar rotates within the Black community, right? Longer than it does in the white community, 33 times it's gonna stay in here and rotate through before it leaves our community. And we say that white folks come in and completely decimate what was being constructed there. And then 100 years later, we want to have a conversation about why Black Americans can't have a certain upward mobility. And it's like, we cannot talk about this moment and poverty and the way that Black communities are disenfranchised if we don't look at the steps that were taken during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, during the Civil Rights Movement, and really think about the ways that the rights that a lot of immigrants have in this country were fought for by Black Americans in this country. And so it is a difficult conversation to have when you come from somewhere else. And for me, the history that I know is the one that I've had to teach myself in many ways, right? And then try to figure out how can I communicate that in Spanish? How can I figure out how to then get this across to a generation that's coming with a very different background in protest and in all of this. And so I think that it's been pivotal for me to do as much reading as possible, if for nothing else, so that I can pass on the information to the Latinx folks that I know need to be in solidarity in this moment.
Liz, you wrote a recent Instagram post about the success of your new novel, Clap When You Land. And you said, quote, I am lucky to come from mentors, specifically bro sis, who have taught me the principle of Ubuntu. I am because you are. What exactly did you mean by this?
So the novel debuted on the #2 spot in the New York Times. And I think sometimes folks try to hail certain accomplishments that my books have solely on me. And probably because of the background of what I learned in Rosis, of what I learned about Sankofa, right? You always look back, you always reach back, you bring people with you. The idea of I am because you are, any success I have is because of the community that's behind me, who holds me up, who holds my work up, who makes sure that they're forming book clubs, they're sending it to their mamas, they're translating passages. Like, it is this idea of I am only here because of the community who holds me. And I'm here trying to reflect us, right? But then you reflect me. Like, if you see me and I'm seeing you, like, that is that connection. And so, you know, in that moment, I try to be mindful of the celebrations that fall on me that I don't think are solely mine.
Khary, can you kind of elaborate on the I am because you are and what that tells us both about COVID-19 and about the protests sweeping our nation? Can you kind of like speak on that intersection?
I mean, I think there's an internal, essentially, intra reflection of that quote, and then an external. I mean, I think the intra is that, you know, again, the kind of struggle for freedom, the legacy of that movement, that we are all interconnected. I mean, Liz mentioned that, you know, the quote from Trump is a clear whistle to white supremacists of the control of Black and brown bodies. In the same way, our tactics today are following in line of what happened before us, whether it was, again, the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, the labor movement in this country. So we are today the activists that we are. I think we are the artists that we are, because we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. I mean, I don't write the way I write. Liz doesn't write the way she writes without all of the ways that we have been influenced by the writers and poets and creators who came before us. I mean, those are the shoulders we stand on. But then I think there's also this external piece to it, which is what I think is what's bringing out such diversity in terms of marches around this country. You know, this issue of white supremacy, this issue of structural racism is not something to be cured or fought against by Black and brown people solely. We did not create it. It was thrust upon us. You know, Liz is Dominican because the slave ship left West Africa and dropped her people on the island of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? My root goes to the South in this country because that's where the ship dropped people here. The reality is that white supremacy and the history of systemic racism has created the diaspora, right? That's the reality of our experience. But what's the next step? What is finally dealing with and confronting with this original American sin of racism? And to me, that's white people realizing that they have to join hands with us, that they have to do this work that's necessary to deconstruct this, to decimate white supremacy, to push back on the kind of racist policing and murders of citizens, that the only way this works is if we are connected and interconnected. This is not the province of Black and brown people alone. We're not the ones who created the situation. We cannot be the ones to clean up the situation. And so when you mention COVID, it's the exact same reality. The reason that Black and brown people are dying at higher rates from COVID is not because we're Black and brown. There's not something inherently different about us biologically. It's because of the poverty that Black and brown people live in disproportionately. It's because Black and brown people are in more of the frontline positions and are being exposed to it. They're riding transportation, which makes them exposed to it. They live often in substandard housing or more intimate housing where you cannot socially distance, and that's simply not a possibility. People are losing jobs because of it. You know, let's look at just the issue in New York around food and young people. In upper middle class and wealthy spaces, disproportionately white, the idea is we're not going to go to supermarkets. or we'll go once a week or once every 2 weeks, and we'll buy large amounts of food so we're not exposed, and our family will eat from that, or we'll have things delivered. But what happens in working class Black and brown communities? We're telling our kids to go every single day to schools to pick up 3 meals a day, to leave your house, to be exposed, to stand online, to get a meal, to bring it home. So these are economic realities that are part of systemic racism that are producing the kind of COVID numbers that we're seeing. Again, there's nothing inherently deficient about Black and brown people, but that somehow we are more exposed to the virus because we're Black and brown. It's an issue of poverty. It's an issue of racism. It's an issue of white supremacy in terms of these realities. And so if we are all connected as humans, then we have to all fight in this country for this country to live up to this aspirational goal, this concept that it's never lived up to. And in order to do that, it cannot be the work of Black and brown people alone. It must be the work of everybody who takes this on. And so the hope is that this is a moment when more of America is confronting what Liz and you and I knew growing up in this country was a reality, that we've been organizing and protesting about at Bro Sis for so long. We've known all this. We know the realities of structural racism and pervasive racism in the police department, but it's as if something has cracked open and the light is now shining in an entirely different way. And I think that more of America is finally aware of what's happening. The question is, what will happen next? And will the work, the structural work, be done to actually change these realities?
So what you just said made me think of a question, particularly about our systems. A lot of times in the mainstream press, when you have a killing of someone like George Floyd, or you have protests like these, or if you have like a grave injustice, like someone who's been put on death row for a crime they didn't commit and they're released, often the mainstream press will say this, system is broken, the system is broken. But I've often argued, and I know many other people of color, especially Black people, have argued that the system is working exactly the way that it was designed. Can either of you, Khary or Liz, speak on how, in many ways, because of systemic racism, the things that plague Black and brown people aren't just happening because they're happening, but are happening because that's the intent of our systems?
I mean, I think if we just want to talk about like the institutions that are in place and the ways in which they're upholding exactly what their mission statement was, I think I'm going to look at the example just of publishing, right? There was a report that came out today from Lee and Low, which is a minority-owned publishing house that does a lot of work to try to figure out the numbers, who is actually publishing books, right? So 5% of all authors published in the US are Black. Less than 5% of publicists are Black. Less than 4% of editors are Black, right? And so if we talk about books like we did earlier, art as a reflection of who we are, and then we look at who are the hands that are actually touching the books that allow us to see ourselves. And then we look at the actual percentages of who is in this country and how the books coming out don't reflect who's in this country. I mean, we just keep circling back to the ways that these institutions were not built for us and have not modified in order to or not even modified, have not radically rethought what their purpose is in order to serve what they're trying to do. If we are trying to put books into the hands of people so that they can see a reflection of the world that allows them to be more empathetic or more thoughtful or more critical, but we only allow one lens to be the folks who do all of the marketing, all of the publicity, all of the editing, we're gonna keep getting books like American Dirt. We're gonna keep getting, barbed wire centerpieces. We're going to keep having these narratives that are pushed forth that actually are not a reflection of what's at play and aren't being sourced from spaces that understand that. And so I think that it is about institutions being completely flipped. But most people think that if we just reform, if we do this, we'll allow one intern in, we'll allow this one, these very performative kind of, we'll give you a crumb, that's enough. And I think time and time again, if we look at the statistics, it's just, reformation is something that we have to be incredibly critical of any institution that we're talking about, because every institution in this country is built on white supremacy. And so it's not just about enough of us being in the room, it's about reshaping the entire house.
Khary, can you jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Liz totally and everything she said. I think that there's a very dangerous narrative that has always existed in this country that when folks have sought to push back on racism, it has been the individual racist. It has been the individual act of racism. And so I think, there are two words or phrases that are thrown around a lot: white supremacy and structural racism. And I think they need a little unpacking. This idea of structural racism is not about the individual, it's about the actual structures. It's why the word is within the phrase, that structures are created that regardless of individuals will propagate racism. When you look at white supremacy, it's not about an individual. It's not about a person who happens to be rich. It's not about one person. It's about this system of supremacy around whiteness, something that doesn't even exist, that many people have written about before. People were Irish, people were French, people were German, people were Russian when they were in their countries. Maybe they were even oppressed because of their ethnic specificity. And then they come to America and they become white. And they inherently receive the privilege of whiteness in the country. So when you look at those two phrases, let's look at two institutions. Let's look at financial institution, banking, let's look at prisons. You look at this as a country that has used white supremacy and systemic racism to keep Black people from developing wealth. A lack of an access to the systems that protected people, whether it was welfare or social security. Black people could not access that all over the country for decades. When you look at the 40 acres and a mule that was supposed to be delivered to Black people as free men and free women, that was stopped not by individual racists, but by state racism. When you look at the lack of ability of Black people to buy homes and the GI Bill, the reason Black people were precluded was because of state systems, again, not individuals. When you look at redlining of our communities, that's Black and brown people not allowed to get loans, to buy homes, to build wealth for no other reason that they were Black and brown, and that's a state system. And so slavery was legal, segregation was legal, redlining was legal. All these forms of oppression were legal. These were state done. And that's what we mean by systems. It's not about one individual. It's about the system is set up to preclude the development of Black wealth in this country for generations. And then on the other side of that comes the prison system. It is not a coincidence that the prison population exploded 400%, basically back to the civil rights movement achieving certain advancements in this country. If previously segregation controlled Black and brown bodies, now what will be done to control bodies? And so to your point, it's not about individual Black people receiving the death penalty. It's that the entire system of capital punishment or the criminal justice system is implemented differently on Black and brown bodies. The Legal Defense Fund did the preeminent study on this issue, and they found the subjective decision at every point. Where do you send police officers to patrol communities? That's the subjective decision, right? And you put them in Black and brown communities and not white communities. What do they choose to arrest people for? That's a subjective decision. They will arrest Black and brown young people for marijuana or open containers, and they won't do that in white communities. After they arrest them, who do they bring charges against? That's a subjective decision. Who do prosecutors choose to seek time for? Subjective decision. Who is sentenced? Subjective decision. At every single level, there's a subjective decision that's a part of a criminal justice system that is without equality to its very core. And so it doesn't have to be one white police officer or one white prosecutor or one white judge. The system that is unequal will take care of ushering that person through so that the result is profoundly unequal. And that's what we mean by systemic racism. That's what we mean by white supremacy. It's not about an individual. It's about systems operating until they are deconstructed or broken down completely to the ground.
Thank you. So I want to touch back again on COVID-19 and its intersection with this movement around the injustices that exist in our society along the lines of race. How do we build a community in this time of social distancing? You know, like we've lost communal space, you know, we've lost the ability to safely, you know, gather in many ways. So we've lost some places of creativity. What effect does this have on art and activism? And has it had any effect on your own creativity personally? Elizabeth, you can start.
Yeah, I'm been thinking a lot about this, right? I'm in Washington, D.C. I mean, the number of caravans that we've seen, I'm not too far from the White House. So it feels very physical. It feels very present that there is a change in the city, right? Every day I'm kind of like, I don't know what the curfew is going to be. And you might get caught in the middle of that, of not knowing what's happening. And so I've been sitting with a lot with how the virtual spaces are attempting to recreate the community spaces that have always been physical. And so, for example, there's a Kid Lit rally happening tonight. There's going to be over 20 different authors for children, and it is a rally specifically for children. The first time it's ever been done where you talk about Black Lives Matter to kids by people who write for kids. And I could never have imagined that we were going to try to gather 20, 30,000 people on their laptops to talk about anti-Blackness, and specifically for the ages of 8 to 18. Right. And so I think that we're having to be incredibly innovative in terms of what it means to organize, what it means to be present, and how does every individual use whatever platform they have to be incredibly thoughtful. And so the number of threads that I've seen on Twitter or on Instagram from folks who I think are usually, I want to talk in person, or I want to have longer conversations, or I need the nuance, who are trying to figure out, can I use this technological space that I may not be super comfortable with, but because of the urgency of this moment, I want to teach myself how to push forth and rethink what I think about as gathering, right? And so that's what I've been focusing on, and just thinking through and following the lead. I think there's a lot of really smart organizers who are at the forefront of how do we spread information, how do we vet the folks who are coming in, and all of that is happening in these spaces that, are virtual and digital. And so I don't know, it's nerve-wracking to think about the numbers of people who are gathering, and specifically knowing who those folks are. It is so scary and heartbreaking to consider how this illness might spread in the same communities that it's already kind of been attacking. And so I've been urging folks to think of the many different ways that we can be purposeful right now. And that if it is being in the streets and you can do that and you're able-bodied and healthy, that's what it should be. If it can be being online, if it's just talking to your family, if it's FaceTiming with a collective of people, or speaking directly to a classroom via Zoom, I just think that we all have to be thoughtful about, what am I doing in this moment and what can I do? And whether it's from a computer screen or whether it's in front of the White House, I think there is a role for everyone to play.
Khary, has this moment affected you and your work as an activist and an artist personally?
Well, as an artist, I definitely feel like I am mourning some of the spaces of creativity and inspiration that are not accessible right now. I live in Harlem, I'm born and raised in New York, and the art and culture of the city has always been a solace to me, inspirational, a place I go by myself, a place I go with friends and loved ones. And to not have those spaces of creation, of music and galleries and museums and public art, that has been difficult. I've mourned that. I think there've been other spaces, to Liz's point, that have stepped up. And I think that people have been innovative in this time. Whether it's been the kind of online conversations, and we've tried to do a lot of these at BroSis that have built community, which I think is part of what today's about. But it's also, about, the kind of online concerts and music that have inspired people. And whether that's, Beanie Man and Bounty Killer, or, the celebration that gave us one evening.
Are you watching Versus?
Of course. And, also, whether it's, Badu and Jill Scott, and that woman, that moment of kind of Black womanhood and them going back and forth in that, with that energy. So I think we've created spaces that have been inspirational, but I still miss those spaces. I think as an activist, COVID has really affected this ability to protest in a particular kind of way. I'm a protester. I love marching. I love being out there. I love the energy that I get from others. I am not afraid of the space or the confrontation. And many of the people I normally would march with are home because they are concerned to be exposed because of their age, or because they have asthma, Or how do I march with my sisters and brothers in Brooklyn when I live in Harlem? And how do I get there, especially with the mayor putting in place a curfew and shutting down so many of the ways for me to move around. So the way that COVID has affected our time of protest has been very difficult. And, I always have heard stories from my mother, who was very involved in the women's movement, of her father, who was a communist organizer in this country, in prison for his political beliefs. And both in the women's movement and in that communist labor movement, the ability to sit in another living room, to have spaces, women's groups, spaces where organizers and activists would sit and build together and build community has been vital to every movement. And of course, people aren't welcoming people into their living rooms right now. We're not having those small conversations. And so I feel a lack of space, a lack of creative space. And I think that's been hard. I think for me personally, the last point I'd make on this is that there are times where the onslaught, and it feels like an onslaught right now, between COVID and between the killing of George Floyd that's lit a match under so many people, the onslaught can produce creativity. It can make you want to create, to build, to write. And I've written several pieces now about this time. But there are other times where it dulls you, where you feel a nerd, where you feel depressed, where you feel low because of what's going on. And the onslaught that's coming from this, carnival barker buffoon who sits in the White House, it's the daily repetitive pounding on your psyche. And I think that's hard for many artists to create. I think that was pre-COVID. I think that was pre the explosion of protests in the country. And all of it together now feels like this kind of, this wave, this tsunami that you're pushing back against. And so to me, I think every day is different. I think artists feel inspired some mornings, and some mornings, it may be hard to get out of bed.
And I've been thinking also, Khary, if I can jump in real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I've been considering with particularly writing fiction is I'm not sure the world I'm supposed to be imagining, right? If a book takes 2 or 3 years to be written, to be published, and that's on the very quick end, right. I have no idea what the world, what the audience. And so sometimes when I sit down and write, it feels like, is this already historical fiction? Right. Like, what is contemporary fiction in this moment? I'm not sure how I fit into the genre. And so part of the stop is I don't want to write about COVID, but I'm not sure the world I'm supposed to be imagining. Right. And it might be science fiction. It might, who knows? And so that's kind of been a bump. And in terms of like how community happens, I had to be really thoughtful about like hitting up my homies who are writers, and can we set up a weekly date where we send each other pages and we check in, because otherwise I don't think I will push myself to be creative. And like Khary was saying, there is something about being re-energized by other people who are also trying to do that work, and who kind of remind you like there will be an existence after this where this work will matter, right? And I think sometimes when you're in the thick of it, it feels like what does a poem or what can a character study do when it feels like there's more urgent places to put my energy. And so that reminder of this will be needful. This will be needful. Just it's a hard hope to have, but I think it's one that a lot of creatives are having to lean into in this moment.
Yeah, let me just respond to that too, because I feel like, there are two different kind of ways that I write and express myself. And, my novel Passage was the story of a young man's coming of age between Harlem and Brooklyn. And he's surrounded by deep family love, and a mother and a father and a little sister who he loves. And he's coming from that space. It's not a space of deficit. But the moment he leaves his home, he's confronted with all those socioeconomic conditions that we know about. The scene opens with essentially a police riot. His best friend is incarcerated. There's so many issues that speak to the realities today, including that he's visited or haunted by the history of Blackness in this country. And it's very much a novel in conversation with other kind of novels throughout history of its type. But what I've written parallel to that for much of my life have been personal essays. And this is exactly what Liz is talking about. Essays that comment about race and poverty, essays that comment about social justice and art and activism. How does one write right now about Blackness in America and not write about COVID? How does one write right now and not write about Trump because of its effect on Black and brown communities? And yet I don't want him in my head.
Right.
I don't want to write about him. Right. I don't want to talk about him. And when these essays come out, will they feel from another time because we're now talking about another issue? And so you're confronted with several themes that people want to know about and talk about, and yet you may not want to spend your intellectual ability or your artistic ability on that. I don't want to spend one more moment thinking about a man who I never thought I would have to think about this much, right? I don't want to write about him. Yeah. And yet, how can one not?
Yeah. Exactly, exactly. So speaking back on artists and activists, and just really anyone who has thrown themselves completely into this moment and been activated by it. A week ago, I wrote an article on The Root that basically outlined how devastating it is to cover Black death over and over and over again in day out as a journalist, as a Black journalist in particular. And so I'd love to hear from both of you your advice to Black creatives, to activists and organizers, to Black journalists who are covering this moment. How can they continue to feed their spirits? How can they continue to stay safe? How can they continue to create and be productive? If you have any tips or advice at this time for them. I know I'm asking for myself too.
I know, I hear you. I mean, I've been thinking a lot in preparation for this conversation of, I was 12 years old and the Brotherhood Sister Soul does this big event every year, a fundraiser, a gala called Voices. This was my first year in the organization and I wrote a poem for Amadou Diallo. This was as a 12-year-old. And to 20 years later, be writing a new poem for Breonna Taylor and having to sit with, and this isn't a short span, this is just 20 years, right? And so then to carry, like, I am so tired of these poems that feel necessary, right? And yet I wish were obsolete. I wish this poem would be rendered useless, but it's not, because we have to hold that name and we have to sit with this moment and also chronicle this moment, right? Like that is the writer's job, I would say, is to chronicle the moment. And not I would say, right? I'm quoting someone, quoting Tony. But I really am reflecting on what that heaviness does when you feel like there's only one subject or a subject that keeps coming up and you don't want to look at it anymore because it hurts. But also feel responsibility to have to look at it because otherwise it will fall to the wayside. And as someone who is attempting to still be creative, part of what I'm trying to do is write historical fantasy, right? And so rethinking history in a way that positions it from another perspective I may not have seen. And so that kind of feels like an interesting ancestral project. I don't know the roots, but can I reimagine it? Because I think if I can do that backwards, I might be able to do that forwards, right? But if I can also look back and realize I am here, then something survived. And I think there's a little bit of hopefulness in what I am writing today will probably do that for a future generation. I talk to my nieces all of the time, I call them every day. There is something about a 4-year-old and then we can't see you because we might get sick, but we miss you. Like just that moment of it's still real and it's still true, but like, but you are why. You are why I'm writing, right? You are why I'm here. And so I think whatever folks can do to be incredibly gentle with their spirits, but also really intentional with care. I loved watching Nikki Giovanni speak a couple of weeks ago with Angela Davis and the way that they discussed self-care and specifically self-care within Black communities, and that it's not about a face mask, but it is about literally, is your body fed? Is it watered? Did you get enough sunlight? Have you rested, right? When was the last time you meditated? When was the last time you laughed? I think a lot about folks who are self-isolating and haven't hugged someone in a while. What does it mean to find ways to hold yourself? That I think we have to care for our bodies and our spirits because this is going to be a long fight. Mm-hmm. And I think some folks imagine that like when things open up or maybe in a few months, and I'm really trying to think very long term that we are in for a long haul. And we have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of ourselves. And so I'm hoping that folks make it a priority every day to think about, did I take at least 10 minutes where it was just me ensuring that I'm okay? And if that's crying it out, if that's calling your best friend, if that's FaceTiming your mama, whatever it is. But I hope people are being incredibly intentional in the same way that you might work out or you might eat right, to really care for their spirits and think about, what did I need today? Because I'm worried about just people getting gassed out, and so I think I'm looking to you for tips. You let me know what we're supposed to be doing, but those are some things that I've been focusing on and attempting to bring into the practice of writing and being.
Yeah, I mean, I think what, Liz is hitting on again is that so often what sustained us, what allowed our spirits to heal, has been precluded or interrupted because of social distancing. It's this term that sounds like some futuristic, term from The Handmaid's Tale or something, of social distancing, that what allowed people to fill and full and have a full spirit throughout times of struggle was coming together with loved ones, was dancing together and singing together and breaking bread together. And the energy and intimacy of human relationships, so much of that has now been distanced from people. And so I think that this kind of twin assault is unusually unique right now. And so I do think, to Liz's point, we have to be really intentional about the ways we fill our spirit and feel the spaces so that we can laugh and have a wonderful time and spend time and energy with each other. I echo and share with her this idea of the repetition of it. I mean, I won't go through all the names, but I can sit here and go through 20, 25 names since I was a child of people killed, Black people killed in this country by police, in certain cases by, whether you're talking about Trayvon Martin or whether you're talking about Michael Stewart or Yusef Hawkins, by non-police, but by white racists in the country. This reality is deadening. It's something that's so hard to consistently deal with and return to. And, I posted recently on, social media sites on the gram and on Twitter, a series of quotes of just Black writers and historians in conversation. And the reason was just, again, to show the historic realities of what we're talking about, that from Du Bois to Frederick Douglass, to Ida B. Wells, to Zora Neale Hurston, to Lorraine Hansberry, to Malcolm X, to Martin Luther King, to Audre Lorde, to James Baldwin, to Ella Baker, their quotes could be today. Yeah. And to me, I find sustenance and I find strength in the historic struggle that we're a part of, and the historic movement of artists to push back on these kind of situations. But I also find solace that, this has been a long struggle, and that almost connection to people, even if they're dead, even if they're from another era, to know they're standing with us in a spiritual way, and we're continuing that kind of work.
No, I feel the same way. For me personally, I'm a mental health advocate. And I can't say enough the importance of having an outlet, whether it be a creative one, whether it be one for talk therapy. I myself personally, I live alone. And so I went through a very low period at the beginning of this crisis. And I reached out to, basically medical professionals and my therapist to help me regulate my mood, so I didn't just fall off into the abyss completely. And so I would also encourage, people who are watching, do seek, help from a friend, from a doctor, from a minister, from someone who you trust, if you're going through a hard time right now emotionally with what's occurring in our nation today. What did you say, Elizabeth?
I got therapy in an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's real. I think sometimes it is important to talk about that. We don't want to ask for help. We think everyone is in the same situation. Everyone is also lonely, or I don't know where to reach out. Or it's taboo. And yeah, I'm with you.
No, I'm all for it. I wouldn't be able to do my job without without talk therapy and medical science. Like I need both. Lastly, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to kind of close with this thought. We are in a transformative moment as a country. COVID-19 is going to we don't know yet like how this is going to fully change our society, but our society is rapidly changing already because of it. And this movement, I don't know how it feels for either of you, but this feels very different this time around. The protests that have been organized around George Floyd and the others who have been killed by the police. So it feels like there's finally some momentum. It feels like something big is about to take place. And the fact that we're in an election year on top of it, it just feels like all the stars are aligning in a particular way, that there's going to be some big change. If you could look into your crystal balls and think about where we're going to be 6 months to a year from now, what are your thoughts on that? And do you feel optimistic? Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel pessimistic? Do you feel like it's going to get worse before it gets better? What are kind of your thoughts around where we're heading as a people, as a nation?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I'd go out and play the lotto after this conversation. I'd be out. But, you know, I think that this is a moment. I think we are on a precipice. You know, in another 6 months, we could know that this COVID crisis is going to be with us for the long haul. And we could be standing in a country that will be facing another 4 years of Donald Trump. Right? That's the pessimistic, horrific outlet of 6 months. On the other side, we could have come to terms with COVID, figured out a way for people to live with it. And we could have an election that in no way represents fundamental change. I don't think Joe Biden represents fundamental change, but it creates the spaces that you're talking about for organizers and activists to push conversations and push him and his administration and anyone else who's elected to finally tackle these issues around income inequality and housing and healthcare and institutional racism. So again, that's not Joe Biden. He's not going to do that. But the landscape would be very different if we can, you know, get this this carnival barker out of the White House. So we are in that moment, this precipice. It does feel different to me in terms of organizing and activism. I think part of that's because of COVID. People are home. People can join the streets. People can protest because they're not at their places of employment. But it also feels like there's been a new level of awareness. And, you know, I call myself a realistic optimist. I couldn't do the work that I do. I could not be able to. Hello, are you still with me?
Yeah, you're still there.
Okay, something went happen with my screen, but I'll keep talking. So, you know, I could not be able to do the work that I do and be the organizer that I am without being optimistic that we can change conditions. But the realism is focused on the depth and the height of what we are facing, how difficult it will be, and that to really change this country in the ways we've talked about today means changing the structures of the country and the fundamental nature of this country. And there are elements of this country that will fight to its last breath to stop us from making this country more equitable, more fair, more equal. And so I'm optimistic, but I'm also quite realistic.
Liz?
Yeah, I think my most hopeful self is looking at two particular things. The way that people are pushing ballot voting and just the thoughtfulness around, okay, regardless of what happens in the presidential election, how are we ensuring that communities are getting representatives that are radical? And I think hopefully we will see some voting that happens that allows for some radical politicians that are really of the community to be in place. And I think we're starting to see that slowly as these primaries keep coming forth. And I'll say that the other one that I didn't know too much about and that I'm trying to learn more about is the divestment of police force, right? Like how do we divest, how do cities divest? And I know that is one of the big calls happening right now. Like how do we ask cities to completely overhaul the way that they fund, right? A lot of law enforcement. And so I think that those are reasonable and possible outcomes and very hopeful outcomes, but ways that potentially small changes that will ripple and have ripple effects. And I mean, none of us know. Similar to Khary, I don't know what this is going to look like. I know right now all the polls are saying very different things in terms of how Americans are responding to what the president is saying in regards to race. And it's been incredibly polarizing, but also very different than the way that a lot of his supporters have talked about him in the past. And so we'll see, but I think that those 2 points of people who are pushing for down ballot voting and how do we ensure to get people in wards and in areas that can really support the communities, and how do we divest from law enforcement in the ways that would ensure that communities get the funds that they need to actually address the root of a lot of these problems, as opposed to the policing, right? As opposed to the symptom. Let's look at the illness. And so those are the 2 things. If I had a crystal ball that I could.
No, that was great. That was great.
And Danielle, I would just add quickly to that also that what's our alternative? I mean, I think that's a question for us and for everybody listening. What's the alternative? I mean, this is a country that since its founding has had an internal struggle going on about what this country will look like. And so for those of us who believe in an inclusive, embracing, human, interconnected nation, if we're not fighting, if we're not optimistic, if we don't engage in the struggle, then what? And so I think we must.
Exactly. We have run out of time. We're actually a minute over, but it was such a good discussion. I want to thank you, Khary and Elizabeth, for being part of it, and thank Brotherhood Sister Soul and The Root for coming together for this wonderful conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you found it illuminating. I know I found it very helpful. So I appreciate everyone for watching, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.